Hey everyone, welcome back to the garage. My 2003 Toyota Tacoma pickup, the one right behind me, is in need of some maintenance. Now, it's had a valve cover gasket leak for a while now. It's gotten to the point where the oil's actually leaking onto the exhaust headers and starting to create a burning smell. It's not quite reaching to the ground, so I don't get an oil puddle, but it has made me realize that there's one piece of maintenance that I haven't done on this truck that is really needed, and that's a valve adjustment. Toyota recommends every 60,000 miles to have a valve adjustment performed on one of these 3.4 liter V6 engines, codenamed the 5VZ-FE. Most people never get this service done because the engine just keeps running well. You know, my truck has 130,000 miles on it and it runs fine, and you never think that it needs this maintenance done. Tons of trucks have 300,000 miles on them without ever touching the valves. However, I like to know that all maintenance is up to spec, so we're going to do a valve adjustment on one of these. It is a bit more involved than your typical valve adjustment because it does have a shim over bucket design, meaning if a valve clearance needs adjusted, you have to pull out the old shim and order a new shim, which means you're probably going to be down for a few days while you order that new shim in and wait for it to be delivered. So in this video, we're not only going to be replacing the valve cover gaskets, we're going to see what it takes to actually do a valve adjustment on one of these 3.4 liter Toyota V6s. So, first thing to do is start removing the intake plenum and get to those valve covers. Let's get to it. Alright, so the intake plenum is out of the way, and I've removed the spark plug coils, spark plug wires, just to give us a little better view here. And I undid all of the fuel injector connectors and the fuel injector wiring harness cover right here. So these are your fuel injector connectors that come off pretty easily. I sprayed a little bit of WD-40 on there to help them slide off the fuel injector. I also put some towels in the intake ports there so we don't accidentally get some dirt in there, because again, this has never been taken apart in 15 years or 130,000 miles, so things are pretty gnarly in there. Now we get a better view with all of the intake stuff out of the way about how much it was leaking. You can see all of that oil residue on the right hand valve cover and on the left hand valve cover. About the same story over here. And again, as that oil starts to leak down, it hits the exhaust manifold there and it just starts burning off. So one quick note on these injector wire harness covers. They're plastic, they're hard and brittle. All of the mounting bolts had already cracked their mounting locations on the cover, so there's no chance that'll ever go back to the way it was. For example, right here you can see that used to be a complete circle around there. It's broken. It happened just with the normal heat cycles of the engine. I didn't even do it. So getting to the valve cover bolts is a little bit tight when you get up here to the valley of the engine, but you should be able to get a ratchet extension in there. These are all 10mm bolts, and it should come off fairly easily. So that's going to be the next step, is getting these covers off. And you want to be very careful because you can see how dirty these are. There's not a real good way to clean them before you pull them off, so you just got to be very careful. You don't want dirt and dust and rocks getting inside of the cylinder head, so just be careful. valve covers are out of the way, and now we have total access to the valve train. Now, before I start doing some clearance measurements, I want to clean the gasket surface here so that we don't accidentally knock in some dirt. Now we're ready to take some valve clearance measurements. Now before I continue, I do want to point out a couple things that I had to undo in order to get the left side valve cover off. I did have to undo this wiring harness bracket down there where the thermostat housing is. I did have to undo this clip here that holds the wiring harness to the side of the cylinder head. And then I had to undo with this fuel overflow, or yeah, I think it's a fuel overflow hose from the fuel pressure regulator there. And I also took off this engine lift bracket that was over on the side. So a few more things to actually get clearance to pull this thing out. It's really tight to get that valve cover out of there. Now moving on to doing the valve clearance check. We are going to use a 1/2-inch ratchet with a 19mm socket on the end of it. And we're going to put this on the crankshaft bolt. So it's down there. It's a little hard to catch on camera, but I just kind of maneuver this in there. Find the bolt. And there we go. So now we turn the engine over. Again, we're looking for that top dead center mark. We can start to see it. I put a little yellow mark on that. So we're bringing it up to 0. And now we're going to look to see if this is the correct revolution or if it's a 360 degrees out, because again, a 4-stroke engine rotates twice for every complete cycle. We look at cylinder 1, both camshaft lobes are not depressed, so we know that those valves are closed. If we look at the back side of the cam sprockets, sure enough, both of these have arrows that are pointing at each other. Oops. Okay, look at the other side. Okay, we're good. All right, so the first pair of valves we're going to be taking a measurement of are cylinder 1 intake valves. So we're going to start off here. So I put in the smallest allowable clearance and it passed easily. So let's bump it up to the maximum clearance and see what we have. Okay, the maximum can't fit, so I think we're within range here. Let's just see if we can find out the exact measurement. Okay, so both of these are measuring at 0.152 millimeters. So that's within acceptable clearance. All right, so now we move on to cylinder 3 exhaust valves right here. So the smallest clearance allowable fits nicely. So let's try out a little bit larger and see what our actual clearance is. Okay, so the clearance is 0.356 millimeters on that one, which is on the upper side of the allowable measurements, so that's good. Let's move on to cylinder 2 exhaust valves. So those are right here. So 0.381 will go in there, but it's quite snug, so I would say it's just slightly smaller than 0.381, and if anything, on an exhaust valve, running it a little loose is far better than running it too tight. I'm not going to try and adjust that and bring it back down to the middle, because having it loose means you have room for that valve seat to recede a little bit more, and you know, as miles get piled on, that's something that might happen. But being a Toyota, it might not happen, but running it a little bit loose is always preferred over running it too tight. All right, now we'll do cylinder 6 intake, starting with the smallest allowable measurement first. Okay, so this one is 0.178, and that one's 0.152. All right, so both are within spec. All right, so that's our first set of valves taken measurements on, and they all checked out okay. Now, to get the rest of the valves, we have to rotate the engine 240 degrees, and that'll get us our next set of valves. And then our last set of valves require another rotation of 240 degrees, and that should get you all your valves checked. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of these revolutions and check all the valves here live on camera. So if you need to see the exact procedure on which valves are related to which rotation of the engine, check out the link in the description of this video where I have a link to my website that has the document that goes over the exact procedure for checking each individual valve. I'm just going to go ahead and do the rest of these valves, and then I'll see you on the other end when I have all the measurements defined. So I've taken all the valve clearance measurements, and I was surprised at what I found. All of my valves are either right in spec or larger than the expected clearance or required clearance. So let's go to cylinder 5 right here. One of the exhaust valves we're measuring 0.406 millimeters when the maximum spec is 0.37 millimeters. If we move to cylinder 6, so we have 0.381 and 0.406 on those. On cylinder 4, we've got 0.406 and 0.406 showing, and same thing with number 2, we have one at 0.381 on the exhaust valve. So we've got 6 valves that are technically out of spec, and they're all on the exhaust side, but they're larger than the clearance. When I first got in here, I was expecting to find some that were tighter than the clearance. Really, that's what you expect when you go in to check valve clearance, is that things get tighter. So with these findings, I'm just not gonna mess with changing the shims at all, because really looser is probably better in this case, especially as you go forward with putting more miles on it. It will eventually tighten up, and that spec will actually help you as you go forward. And I'm going to stop here because I know I'll take flack for it in the comments for not bringing these 6 exhaust valves back into spec. In a perfect world with unlimited time and resources, I'd probably do it, but I also know I'm not doing any damage to the engine by leaving it as is. This low revving V6 is not going to damage the valve stems when subjected to marginally large valve lash. If anything, it gives the valves more room to close up, which is the typical wear pattern for the valve train. I don't want to deter anyone from making such an adjustment on their engine. I do want to make it clear that this was my personal choice, and you may or may not agree with it. Okay, let's get back to it. I'm still going to show how to change out a shim just in case you go in there and find that you have a too tight of clearance and you need to change a shim out. Now, before you can do a valve adjustment on one of these Toyota engines, you need one of these special tools. It's made by Schley Products and it's number 88250. And it looks pretty simple, but it's required to get these shims out of there. So you just wrap this around the camshaft and to depress the shim bucket, and then you put this in between the shim bucket and the camshaft, and then you should be able to get the shim out. Now that's easier said than done, and I'm going to show you why that is. So let's go take a look. All right, I'm going to demonstrate this on a valve that doesn't even need adjusted, and the reason because of that is it's so hard to get a camera perspective on any of these other valves. There's just so much in the way, and even with this, it's going to be kind of hard to see what's going on, but I'm going to do my best here. So you take these pliers and you wrap them around the camshaft. You also want to make sure that there's a little indentation in the bucket itself. You want to make sure you have access to that because you're going to need to feed a screwdriver into that, a little flathead screwdriver, in order to pop the shim out. So before you put these pliers in, make sure that's oriented correctly. And the pliers themselves kind of have an eccentric built into them. So you wrap it around the camshaft and you depress, as you rotate it, you're depressing the valve shim bucket. And then you take this little tool right here, and you can see on one end it's got kind of a long piece to it, and you want to place that on the bucket. This is, again, always easier said than done, because you really have to see with your fingers. Like, you really can't see it, because you're wanting to hit the edge of the bucket. You don't want to put it on top of the shim itself, because if you do that, well, then you can't get the shim out. Okay. Well, it slipped off. See, you just got to keep fighting it. I mean, it's literally maybe the area of 2 millimeters that you have to place this on. think I finally got it here. So you gotta be careful because that will just pop out of there so easily. Then you just, like a small flat blade screwdriver in that little cutout, and try and pop this thing out. Okay, I just pried the shim out, and then you take your magnet and go bloop, and then there you go, your shim is out. Now you don't want to rotate the engine while that's in place because it'll just slip out and then you've really screwed up your camshaft. So you want to pull this out and then take it over to the bench and take some measurements so you know what the new shim should be. Now to get a measurement of it, you have to get a micrometer like this. I just bought this at Harbor Freight. I think it was like under 20 bucks. And you'll just sandwich the shim in the middle of it to get the clearance. Let that tighten down. We'll see if the shim measures at 2.88 millimeters. Once you have your valve shim measured, then you run it through this little calculation to figure out the new valve shim size. So we take the observed valve clearance minus the preferred valve clearance. So we have 0.406 millimeters minus 0.32 millimeters. Then you add the shim measurement. So you add that plus 2.889, and that gives you this 2.975. That's the new shim size, or close to what the new shim size should be. So Toyota has this list of shims that they have, and the closest one to that number is a 3 millimeter shim, so shim 11 from Toyota, and that's what you'd want to order if you wanted to change the shim size. All right, now that you've taken your shim measurement, you want to put the shim back into place until you have your new shim on hand. So we'll just plop this back in there. It's all a very delicate touch, all this. Okay, it's now reseated. And with your shim back in place, then you take the pliers and depress the bucket again. And then you pull out the second tool and then release the pressure on the valve bucket. And that's one shim removed and replaced. Before we start putting that engine bay back together, let's take a look at all the new parts we'll be putting in to seal it all back up. Over here on the bench, we have everything needed to fully seal up the valve covers. So starting off over here, you'll need 2 of these gaskets for the intake plenum. These are identical, but you do need 2 of them. They're a metal-based gasket, and I always recommend just buying original Toyota parts. They're not that expensive. Here we have the new valve cover gaskets themselves. Again, you just buy 2 of the same part. And then I've got a new oil filler cap seal. The one I have in there is pretty hard, and I think it's leading to a little bit of a leak as well, so I've got a new one of those. And over here we have the valve cover bolt washers. These are rubber and metal combined type washers, so they do seal up. It's a good idea to replace those. And then over here I have 2 cam bearing cap end plugs. So these are on the back side of the cylinder head, right up against the firewall. You'd be surprised how much of the oil leak actually originates from these pieces right here. And then we have the new spark plug seals. That these actually get pressed into the valve cover itself, so it's a good idea to change these out while you're doing everything as well. And then last but not least, we have this Toyota FIPG. This is a form in place gasket sealant. This is probably the best stuff I've ever used. I've used this on various other vehicles of mine, and it works especially well when you're going to install new valve covers. You need to put sealant in the corners where the half moons are. This stuff works so well. It sets up in about 30 minutes to an hour, and it fills in all the little nooks and crannies so you never get another oil leak again. So it is about 15 bucks, but totally worth the money because it is the best stuff you can get. Okay, so the order of events here will be to first reseal these cam bearing caps right here. Those where those rubber plugs go in. We'll have to undo these 2 bolts, and there's 2 bolts on the back side of the cylinder head to undo a bracket, and then the whole piece will come out. Then after that, we will take out these little aluminum half moon plugs. You see I've already dislodged this one and put some sealant on that just to guarantee it's not going to leak for the future. There's 4 of those, so there's 2 of these plugs back here and then 4 of these half moons that we'll have to reseal everything. Then after that, we'll be ready to clean off this gasketing surface, put some FIPG in all the corners, like right here on the half moons and right there in the corners of that circle there, and then we'll be ready to put the new valve cover gaskets in. So let's get started by putting these new plugs in the back and resealing these half moons. so here's the bearing end cap. It doesn't actually support a camshaft, it's just kind of a dummy one. Anyway, I've gone in here with some 3M Scotch-Brite pad. It's the green pad, and it helps you remove all that old silicone sealant. So there's silicone sealant along this edge that mates with the cylinder head, and there was some silicone sealant on this half circle right here where the valve cover gasket mounts. You just want to clean these up, make it look like you've actually been in there. I always like cleaning things up to at least make them look cleaner than they were before. Now, so we've got the bearing end cap here, we've got the half moon here. It's made of aluminum. I've cleaned up all the old silicone sealant in there. I took a pick to get in these grooves right there to get all the sealant out. And then we've got the new bearing end cap plug. And here's the FIPG that we'll be using to reseal these. So we're going to start with the bearing end cap. But for this, we just want to put a little bit here on the ends because this is where it actually mates against the cylinder head. Do that on both sides. Doesn't take much. And then we want to put some in the half moon channels. And then finally, we're going to put some on the perimeter of this new plug because I don't fully trust the sandwiching method of sealing up a circular piece like this. So we're just going to put a little bit of sealant on the edges of this just to make sure that it is sealed once it's installed. Okay, so now these are ready to mount back into the cylinder head. Once that's tightened down, you can see a little squishing out of the sealant there. That's exactly what you're looking for. And there we go, that's one end of the cylinder head done. Now we need to do all the other points on this cylinder head in a very similar fashion. Now before we install new valve cover gaskets, let's clean up these grungy looking valve covers. Alright, I'd say these look a lot better now. I did hit these with a wire wheel on my angle grinder just to get some of that oxidation off of there. So they look much better than they did before. At least you can tell now that someone's been in here and did something. So that's always good. Alright, now we have to remove these little washers for the bolts and then replace the spark plug seals, which require you bending up these little tabs on the back side and then driving them out, probably with a large socket and a hammer. So that's what we're gonna do next. right, so now let's put the valve cover gaskets in the valve covers. So you can see I've got the new spark plug tube seals in there. All right, that's one. Now let's replace the little gasket thing inside of the filler cap. So there definitely is a direction to put this in. The rounded bottom should go towards the top of the cap. So nice. Let's see how this fits on the valve cover. There we go. Much better seal than before. It didn't really seal. It felt like it bottomed out on the metal itself, and now it's actually got that cushion in there. So that is exactly what I was hoping for. Okay, so the next job is to put some of this gasket sealer in the corners on the cylinder head before we plop down the valve covers. so that's everything put back together. New valve cover gaskets and all the valves checked, and everything's good to go there. So hopefully this was helpful for you if you have a Toyota 4Runner or Tacoma with this 3.4 liter V6 engine, the 5VZ-FE. It's a very common engine, it's a very durable engine, and as you can see, even with 130,000 miles on it, the valves are still very much within spec. Again, if you did have to change some shims out, you would have to wait for your dealership to get them in or wherever you order them from, which might take a couple days. But even replacing the valve cover gaskets might take up to a couple days, so be sure to rope off a whole weekend just in case you come across something you weren't expecting. Again, if you're looking to do this job, just check in the description of this video for all the part numbers that I used and even some PDFs on how to do some certain procedures, including the torque specifications for certain bolts. All right, so that wraps up this video. So as always, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you guys again next time.